It's a very sad day, of course. A civilian has passed on due to the incident that took place earlier at Wits University with the students protesting. At the crux of the matter in terms of the protests is people's lack of money to be able to pay, registration fees and other fees, paying their backdated debt and so on and so forth. And we have a fiscal problem. And of course, you're very well equipped to be able to respond and come up with ideas as to what needs to be done.
Nopu, thank you for the invite. This is a watershed day in South African history. It will go down as the first death to the government's irrational austerity policies. I think there's a groundswell of opinion throughout the country and civil society that the time has come for a constitutional challenge against these irrational austerity policies. In the budget speech, the finance minister said about 3 or 4 times that this is not an austerity budget. But I've read every page, 250 pages of that budget, and everywhere it says that every page has got elements of austerity in it. And on page 35 of that document, they say that spending, non-interest spending over the next 3 years will decline. I think it's by 5.2% a year. And if you add population growth, that's about 6.6% a year. So real per capita non-interest spending will decline by about 6.6% a year. There's no precedence in the post-apartheid period for such vicious cuts to government spending. And unfortunately, Nompu, we know that when austerity has there's only one outcome from austerity. It is political instability and rising debt ratio. So South Africa, it's a really sad moment for South Africa. And what you've also seen on the terms of the higher education budget is that the government has cut spending to allocations towards NSFAS, and people won't be able to be funded for teaching degrees. We've got an education problem in our country, health degrees, nursing degrees. We've got a pandemic, and they're going to be doing that. Technical degrees, BTECs at Technicons, and it's insane. And they've cut 8 billion rands from university tertiary subsidies. So I think as South Africans, it's time for a big debate. We need to have this massive CODESA where we talk about the future of this economy. Because since the start of the lockdown, we've entered what I would call the 4th phase in the post-apartheid period. And we've just come out of a lost decade in terms of economic development. On this trajectory, we're going to have a second lost decade until 2030.
So what do you think needs to happen in terms of the current situation that we're faced with? We have, fiscal austerity, as you say. We have a situation where the government, if it decides to spend more on, priorities like education, it's going to have to go and borrow more money from the debt markets. We have looming further rate cuts that we could experience, which affects our ability to borrow on the markets and develop at reasonably, at a reasonable price. How do we, juggle all of these balls and address the issues that we need to address?
Okay, first of all, what I have to say is that our debt to GDP ratio is not high by international standards. Every country in the world, except those in East Asia that managed to save lives and livelihoods, are going to have exactly the same shock to their economy. So the debt to GDP ratio, the world average is going to go, I think it went up by 15 percentage points to 100% of GDP. We went up by 15 percentage points to 80% of GDP. Our debt is still low compared with countries like Brazil, India. Brazil had a far more aggressive response to this crisis than we do, and they had a lower collapse in terms of GDP growth. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that we've got a central bank. I was reading in the budget review the terms of the new development bank loans. There's a 5-year payment holiday on the new development bank loan. There's a 3-year payment holiday on the IMF loan. Why can't the Reserve Bank provide financing to government on those unfavorable terms, where the government doesn't have to pay for the next 3 or 5 years until the economy recovers? There is no reason why the central bank cannot finance proper stimulus and the Public Investment Corporation. And then the third thing that I want to say is that in the immediate thing, we need to recommit the government towards free tertiary education. I believe in free tertiary for everybody, including the children of parents who earn more than 350,000 rand a year. And we also need to write off this student debt. I understand it's about 1 billion rands and start afresh. And in what universe does it make sense to not equip our children with skills that they need to survive in this post-pandemic world. There is no logic towards this. And when the government talks about pro-growth fiscal consolidation, how does funding university and defunding tertiary education contributes towards growth? It does not.
Yeah. What you say is actually quite shocking, because 1 billion rand is really it's just a dip in the ocean when we think about the massive corruption and the kind of
the 2 trillion rands budget as well.
Yeah, exactly, 2 trillion rand budget, but also the level of corruption that we've experienced and that we continue to experience on an annual basis. According to data that comes out from the Auditor General, it does seem like a dip in the ocean. But the reality, of course, is that Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says his hands are tied. At his budget speech, he did indicate that conversations were going to be taking place with himself and the National Department of Higher Education, and that some pronouncements would be made by the midterm budget. But of course, that's in October, and in the meantime, there's students who want to start university now.
And I find it strange that the Department of Higher Education and Training is only now talking about a meeting with Treasury. And this is a crisis situation. So I think we're heading for fees not fall too. And that's what I think is happening in South Africa today.
Duma, thank you very much for your insights there. Duma Gqubule speaking to us there. Let's now go to Busi Sibeko from the Institute for Economic Justice on the Wits protest. Thank you very much, Busi, for joining us. Your quick reaction to what has taken place.
Yeah, we are certainly concerned about what is happening, but as already mentioned, this is an outcome of austerity, the rapid cuts and accelerated cuts, massive cuts to public spending that are currently occurring in our budget more generally.
So what would you have the National Treasury do, given the fact that, there's so many priorities that we have in the economy? Education is one of them, which is pivotal for our long-term development. But then there's everything else as well. And given the fiscal constraints, what do you think should happen?
I mean, there's certainly alternatives. We have been arguing for a long time that austerity is self-defeating during recessionary times, which means that when you cut government expenditure in particular, which makes up 30% of GDP, what you actually do is shrink the economy at a time where private sector itself is shrinking. And so, yes, the priorities have to be considered. What does the budget look like holistically? But we'd argue that government has not sufficiently looked for those resources to make sure that all our priorities are met. And in fact, this budget significantly undermines government's ability to progressively realize people's rights. And so this is to say that our government has a lot of options in terms of domestic resource mobilization, and they haven't done so. What they've chosen to do, which is not just a technical exercise, but a political exercise to choose austerity. And they say it's not austerity, but really what they're trying to do is convince us that there are no alternatives. But there are certainly alternatives, and we've continuously over the years put forward alternative economic policies for growth, but also ones that progressively realize human rights in South Africa.
I suppose you're also eagerly anticipating what's going to come out of the cabinet meeting today, because they're deliberating as to where funding can come from for prospective 2021 university students in terms of the NSFAS funding. And of course, there's a big question mark, given the fact that we do have fiscal constraints. What's your expectation and hope?
Well, we have actually called for the MPs to actually reject this budget holistically. And if this budget is rejected as a holistic budget, I think then there'll be more scope to discuss those funding constraints, right? So this is what we've called. We've asked particularly the members of parliament, specifically the honorable members of the standing and select committees on finance, to actually reject this budget and to go back to the drawing board, or call for National Treasury to go back to the drawing board. We're seeing that there are cuts of about 24.6 billion, which are actually being proposed for the Department of Higher Education and Training over the next 3 years. And if the budget is rejected on a holistic forum, then it would require or would enable for them to rethink this budget and the priorities. For instance, Duma's just mentioned here to say that, where is the pro-growth in cutting education funding? How are we thinking about our labor market policies? This budget in itself, in its whole sense, doesn't make sense. There's no pro-growth fiscal consolidation. This fiscal consolidation is going to harm our economy, and in fact, these cuts to education spend are going to have negative ramifications for our labor market in the future. So there's nothing pro-growth about those cuts.
Yeah. I think one of the issues, of course, is that the South African government could go to the debt markets to borrow some more money. And as Duma mentioned, you can have these long-term arrangements whereby you pay later, borrow today, pay a bit later. But of course, we do have a very small tax base in the interim, and that's part of the problem.
I mean, one of the things we've said is that South Africa should not be reducing the corporate income tax rate. There's a lot of evidence that has shown that cutting the corporate income tax rates does not give the returns and investments that are expected. And in fact, all it's done is increase inequality. And this is from an UNCTAD study that took place and was released 2019 to show what had happened after the financial crisis. And so there's a tendency to want to cut taxes as a way to garner investment. But we'd argue strongly against that notion. But also we've put forward in the past multiple other measures that can be implemented given our tax structure. For instance, a wealth tax in South Africa is long overdue and certainly something that can be explored. Another one is a resource rent tax. If people have been following, they'll notice that our mining companies in particular are making a huge killing in the markets because of the way that the commodity prices are benefiting them. And so what we've said is that there should be a resource rent tax which says that after a certain price level, there's an extra additional tax that the South African government can garner from the wealth that's being generated from our natural resources, which should be benefiting the South African or South Africans generally. And so there are many other, like Duma mentions, we can have borrowing arrangements. We can also just think of non-orthodox monetary policy, which Duma began to unpack about what can the South African Reserve Bank do to reduce the cost of borrowing of government, because fundamentally there are only two ways to resolve the current situation we're in. The one is to grow GDP, which is the fundamental issue that everybody's concerned about. If we grow GDP, then we have enough resources to one, service our debt, which is one of the things that has been rising. Our debt service costs are what's concerning us. But if we want to reduce debt to GDP ratio, we have to increase the denominator, which means we have to increase GDP. So that's one of the ways in which we can think about the ways going forward. And obviously the other is to consider these non-conventional measures as well as tax measures to move forward. But ultimately this budget has to be rejected for us to even begin to move in that direction.
Busi, thank you very much for your input there. Busi Sibeko, she's from the Institute for Economic Justice. We're going to go for a quick break and have more news for you thereafter.